right. That's cool.
Hey guys, this is Press Any Button, and here we are for our next part of our rail shooter series. So today we're going to be implementing some hit sparks on objects that we're essentially shooting at to give our player a little bit of feedback on what they've actually hit. Now, to do this, we're going to use something called a raycast, and we're just going to learn how to set that up, especially using our mouse cursor. This is something I hadn't seen a lot of other tutorials doing. It was mainly just from the aspect of making a first-person shooter. So I thought this would be a good thing to implement early on. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, first things first, we're going to go to our hierarchy here, and we're going to right-click and create an empty game object. Now, under my main camera, you can see that I have this game object, which is called gun. This is also an empty game object, and what this is going to do is it's going to hold the script that we're going to be using for firing our shots. Now, I've overlapped it with the main camera. I don't think it particularly matters, but it's a lot more convenient if we just have it attached like that. So I've got my game object here, and what you would do if you don't have that game object already, which you won't, is you just drag this under your main camera, and then it'll become a child of your main camera game component, or you can just drag it straight onto the label of the main camera. Okay, so with our game object, we're going to go to add component, and you're going to create a new script, and you can call this script firing. So it'll ask you to make a script name. As for me, I'm going to go to add component, and I'm just going to bring up my old script. I'll see you guys in Visual Studio. Okay, here we are in Visual Studio. You'll notice that I've got a couple of comments set up, but those are things that we're going to be dealing with in a second. So I start off with a public float, and I call that fire range. Now this public float is going to control the distance that our ray is going to be cast. If you think about a ray cast, it's just a single line coming from a certain point, and when something intercepts that line, we're able to identify what's going to happen to that object. So we're going to be returning to this script quite a few times during our tutorial, but moving on, void update, we have input.getKeyCode down mouse 0. So that means when we left click, then we're going to go into this function which is called shoot. We've defined what this function is down here, so void shoot. And what is that? That is a ray cast. We're sending out a ray from the main camera through our cursor. So our input.mouse position is going to be where the ray is going to come through. And that's going to allow us to aim with our cursor instead of aiming with the main camera in its entirety. Then we have physics raycast. So the ray, it goes out at a particular range, and this range is something that we can identify in the inspector. Because it's a public float, we'll be able to mess around with that when we return to Unity. You can also do it where you can say that it equals something, but I'll just leave it blank for now, and it'll default as 0 in our inspector. And then what happens if we do get a hit? Well, if we do get a hit, then we get a debug log which identifies the name of the game object. Now, the reason why we've only done this much so far, and you can see that we've got more to go, is because I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we all have this working. So if you save this and return to Unity, we can see if it's working. So I have the script attached to gun, and your firing range is going to be 0. So we're just going to change this to 50. But to demonstrate something, I'm going to change this to 1000. Let's start the game. Okay, let's see what happens when we click on one of our cubes. Here we go. We get a little comment at the bottom left here. You can just see it. I can pull up the console and we can see that it's identified that cube. Now let's make sure that we actually got it right. Okay, so if I click on something else, it comes up with cube 1, cube 2, and then back to cube. And if I click out into space where I shouldn't be able to shoot anything, guess what happens? We get plane. So how do we fix that? Well, we just change our firing range. So we change the range of the raycast. So I'm gonna sync it down to 50, and I click on my cube just to cancel out the plane that I clicked on, and then click out into space, and nothing's registering because that object is too far out of our range. And that's what we want, because we don't want to be able to have hit sparks coming off of the air. That just doesn't make any sense. Now, speaking of hit sparks, how are we going to implement that? Well, what we'll do is we'll go to the hierarchy again, and I want you to right click, go to effects, and then particle system. And now there's a ton of menus that we can implement here, but you can see already in my window that our particle system has decided just to play out by itself. And so right now it kind of looks like smoke. Maybe we could use that for a fire effect, but that's not what we're making today. So I'm going to change the duration to 2 under this little menu, and we're going to stop it from looping. So if I restart the animation, as it were, it's going to play for 2 seconds, and then it's just going to stop. 2 seconds, and then all the particles stop coming out. Great, so that's a good start. I'll stop that, make sure it doesn't take up too much space in our resources. And then the next thing we want to do is set the lifetime of our particles. I want the lifetime of my particles to be really short because they'll be like sparks. So I'm going to set this to 0.5. So let's play this. And you know what? They're not really coming out fast enough for it to look like a proper burst. So how about I increase the speed? So we go to start speed, and I increase that to 50. Play that. Okay, I mean, that's alright, but we still got a couple of problems. It's still looking like smoke, like spray. And that's not really what we're going for. We're not going for Squirtle's water gun. We're going for an impact spark. So how are we going to remedy that? Well, we go over to our emission menu here, and that should just be directly under what we've been working with. And in that emission menu, I want you to make the rate over time 0. So all of the sparks are going to come out at the same time. And so if we play that, nothing happens. And that's because we haven't added a new burst. So the list is empty. So where it has this little cross here, we're gonna hit that. That's gonna add a little burst for us. And our burst is set to 30 right now. So if I play that, we can see that about 30 particles, or actually 30 particles come out. That's pretty good. I'm gonna reduce that because I'd like to use 2 particle systems at the same time. So I have 30 particles at a time from our shot. And if I restart that, then you can see there's a few less particles there. I'm gonna stop that. We can leave shape as it is. And the next thing we want to do is go to renderer. Now, instead of using render mode billboard, we're going to use render mode mesh. So on this drop down, just select mesh. It's going to default to a cube. I'm pretty comfortable with cubes and blocky shapes like that. Now, you're going to go over to your assets folder because you can see that the next thing is adding a material. But we don't have any materials as of yet. So how are we going to do that? I go over to my assets folder. And in my assets folder, I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to create. And we're going to go material. Now you can make a materials folder separately. You can call your material anything you like. And we're just going to leave it at that because we're actually going to go back to our particle system menu to edit that material. So where we have our renderer, we're going to select material. I'm going to hit this little bullseye over here, which is going to bring up a menu where we can select that material. And if we scroll to the top here, then you can see the material that you just made. So I double click on my material and it's been selected. and the shader is set to standard. The color is really boring. I mean, if I play it, you can see that it's just a bunch of white cubes, and that's not really what we're going for. So I'm going to stop that, and we're going to change the shader. So we hit this shader drop down here. Then I'm going to go to legacy shaders, and under legacy shaders I'll go to particles, and I like to use additive. Now again, it's just going to be a bunch of white cubes unless we change this. So how are we going to do that? You're going to hit this arrow here, and it's going to give you a little drop down menu, and where it says tint color, we're just going to select that box and create a color for our material. Okay, now what I found is really useful is dragging this little circle over to the very point so that we get the richest color. Otherwise it's going to be a bit transparent, and then you can mess around with what color you want to use. I'm going to go for an orange here, and I'm going to move the alpha up so that it's a little bit more opaque as opposed to transparent. If you want it more transparent, then you go down. If you want it opaque, then you go up. And I think that looks pretty good to me. I can see in the preview it's not quite matching up to what I'm expecting. So remember to have a little shimmy round with your colors and things like that to find what best works for you. Anyway, I'm going to close that menu. It's come out as sort of a yellow, but for demonstration's sake, we'll just stick with that. And then I can go and restart my particle effect and see what happens. And there you should have been able to see that we have little yellow cubes instead of plain, boring, grey ones. Now we can go back to the inspector for our particle system, and we can change one more thing that's just going to make our particles look that bit better. So we'll go to rotation over lifetime here. I'm going to check that box, hit the actual tab. It's going to give you a little menu. We're just going to leave everything as it is, so the angular velocity and the separate axes is going to remain the same. The most important part is that we just check that. You can play around with this, see what works for you, but for now what it's doing is rotating 45 degrees along the X, Z and Y axes. Now let's take a look at our particle effect one more time. And there we can see that the cubes look a lot more individualized. They're all sort of facing different ways. Sometimes we get a little bit of shading, but that depends on what material you're using. So the additive material sort of gives a luminescence, incandescence to our sparks here, so we don't really get any shadows to suggest that these are 3D objects. But you can kind of look at the angles, you can see that that is the side of the cube and all that. Anyway, now that we've got that sorted, we go over to our assets folder, and then we go create a particle effects folder. To create folders, all you got to do is just right click, create folder, and so you do that from your assets folder. I've already got a folder for my particle effects. I'm gonna bring this particle system down into here, and then I can delete it from my scene so that it's not really active anymore. But the good thing about what we've just done is that we've created a prefab for our game object. This is something that we can just make multiple clones out of, so we've got infinite versions of the same game object or particle effect. Now how are we going to implement these as sparks? Well, we're going to go back to Visual Studio. Alright, back in Visual Studio, you're going to see that with my comments I made references to two game objects. So these game objects are actually going to be our particle effects. We're referring to them as game objects because we'll be able to make them interact with the environment that way. So you got this public game object, scatter 1, public game object, scatter 2. That's literally effect 1, effect 2. And so under that void shoot, we had that debug. And next to that, within the same brackets of that if statement, we're going to identify a game object and call it impact go1. And we're going to define that game object as being the result of all this. And all this is instantiating the game object, so our particle effect, at the point of impact with the ray and the object by a quaternion. And this quaternion is always going to face outwards from the object that we hit. So in the demonstration, you would have seen that I clipped the sides of those boxes and the spray came out upwards or down or to the left instead of just coming towards us. So depending on the angle of the object, we're going to get a different angle of spray, which is really good because that's a little bit more realistic. And then we've got our game object 2, so impact go 2, and we just rinse and repeat. You change the name of the game object depending on what you've made your second game object to be called up here, and then hit point that same quaternion. In between those, we destroy these game objects after 1 second, and this is because these particle effects can take up quite a few resources in our games, and we don't want tons and tons of particle effects just sticking around and clogging up our game, because that's not really good for resource management. Alright, we've got the script sorted, so we can save it and return to Unity and test it out. Before we get to test out our script, we got to return to gun again, and you're going to see those game objects are there, but they're left empty. I'm going to change my fire range to 50 again. And I've already got some sparks set up, but you know what? I'm going to get my pink one here. I'm going to mix that with the yellow one that I've just created. Just show you guys that we have walked the right path in terms of creating these particle effects. And then I hit play and we can test this out. Alright, so if I click on the side of this box, that particle effect comes out like that. Hit the front, comes out like that. Hit there. There. You can see my particles are kind of big. I can actually change the size of those, so that's not too much of an issue, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. But for now, we've got a pretty nice effect, to be honest. You know, if we capitalize on this art style, we can make a really good looking game. So let me just show you how to refine the size of your particles a little bit. So I'm going to go to this particle system. Down here, we're just going to go to start size. And for my other particles, you can see the start size is a lot smaller. So it's 0.1, 0.2 with a range to 0.5. So this is if you want to make it so that the range of your particles is a little randomized, which I think would be a good idea to show you. So if you just want it to be one constant size, you just do that. But if you want it to be random between two constants, and I go 0.1 and 0.5, great. And then we can go back into the game and see how that works. Alright, so I fire here and you can see that my particles are a lot smaller than they were before, which is exactly what we want. Maybe my game objects are a little close to the screen, and that's why the particles are spraying out, or maybe I just have to reduce the time that these things occur, or the speed, different things like that. But for now, I think we've done a pretty good job. Guys, this has been another Press Any Button tutorial, and I hope that you have a lot of fun just playing around with particle systems. If you want to keep getting spammed with this good content in your sub box, just hit that subscribe. But either way, guys, whatever you want to do, just press on and keep creating.